out of the conversations with game developers and publishers.
Кодировщик
The
перегружен.
biggest feature in this category is the custom engine for audio. That's today's final topic. The push for
До этого
vastly
стримил раньше,
improved
нормально,
audio,
не знаю, в чем
and in
проблема.
particular 3D audio, isn't something that came out of the developer meetings. It's much more the case that we had a dream of what might be possible 5 years from now, and then worked out a number of steps we could take to set us on that path. So here again are the three principles. The first being enabling the desires of developers to drive the hardware design. To me, the SSD really is the key to the next generation. It's a game changer. And it was the #1 ask from developers for PlayStation 5. As in, we know it's probably impossible, but can you put an SSD in it? That was a discussion we were also having internally. It was clear that the presence of a hard drive in every PlayStation 4 was having a positive impact. A lot of things that would simply have been impossible at Blu-ray disc speeds were now possible. Neither particularly fast nor flexible. If all your data is in one block, which is frankly not very likely, you can load 50 to 100 megabytes a second, depending on where the data is located on the hard drive. Let's assume it's on the outer edge, which means loading a gigabyte takes 10 seconds. If you compress your game packages, you can fit more data on the Blu-ray disc and also effectively boost your hard drive read speed by the compression ratio. We support zlib decompression on PlayStation 4 that gets you something like 50% more data on the disk and 50% higher effective.
Ну что, идет стрим? Нет, я ничего понять не могу.
Unfortunately, though, it's highly likely that your data is scattered around in various files on the hard drive, as well as sourced
Лол. Вообще-то я переименовал показ.
from multiple locations within those files. So lots of seeks are needed at 2 to 50-ish milliseconds each. My rule of thumb is that the hard drive is spending 2/3 of its time seeking, and only
Когда
a
стримил,
third
да,
of its
заранее все
time
настраиваю, так не
actually
получится,
loading data.
как тестить-то, блядь.
Putting all of that
Будем
together,
смотреть.
a gigabyte is very roughly 20 seconds to load from a hard drive. Now, a gigabyte is not much data. Games are using 5 or 6 gigabytes of RAM on PlayStation 4, so boot times and load times can get pretty grim.
Чего?
Or to put that differently, as a player, you wait for the game to boot, wait for the game to load, wait for the level to reload every time you die, and you wait for what is euphemistically called fast travel. And all of that leads to the dream. What if we
Что,
could
всё
have
еще не
not just an
переименовался
SSD,
стрим?
but a blindingly fast SSD? If we could load 5 gigabytes a second from it, what would change? Now, SSDs are completely different from hard drives. They don't have seeks as such. If you have a 5 gigabyte a second SSD, you can read data from 1,000 different locations in that second, pretty much at speed. As for time to load a gigabyte, this is next gen we're talking about, so memory is bigger. Instead, we should be asking how long to
Ну
load
типа да,
2
скучно, блядь,
gigabytes.
заебало.
And the answer is about 1/4 of a second. I mean, that's amazing. We're talking 2 orders of magnitude, meaning very roughly 100 times faster. Which means at 5 gigabytes a second for the SSD, the potential is that the game boots in a second. There are no load screens. The game just fades down while loading a half dozen gigabytes and fades back up again. Same for a reload. You're immediately back in the action after you die. And fast travel becomes so fast it's
Чё
blinking
хуйню
in this.
какую-то
As
стримит,
game
блядь, заебал
creators, we go
нахуй.
from trying to
Я вроде
distract
эту
the player
ссылку
from how
выбрал,
long
блядь.
fast travel is
А он мне
taking, like
хуйню
those
всю
are
показывает
free
и
to
глючит, блядь.
Or to put that differently, with a hard drive, the 20 seconds that it takes to load a gigabyte can sabotage the game that the developer is trying to create. I think almost all of us in the room have experienced this, maybe in different ways. Say we're making an adventure game and we have 2 rich environments where we each want enough textures and models to fill memory, which you can do as long as you have a long staircase or elevator ride or a windy corridor where you
Сейчас,
can
блядь,
ditch
секунду
the old
берем,
assets
хуйню, он
and then
заебал
take
меня.
30 seconds or so to load the new assets. Having a 30-second elevator ride is a little extreme. More realistically, we'd probably chop the world into a number of smaller pieces and then do some calculations with
Хуйня, тогда
sight
что-то не
lines
то,
and
блядь.
run speeds like we did for Haven City when we were making Jack 2. The game is 20 years old, but not much has changed since then. All those twisty
Сейчас
passages are
побыть.
there for a reason. There's a whole subset of level design dedicated to this sort of work, but
Мозгоёбство
still,
какое-то,
it's a
блин.
giant distraction for a team that just wants to make their game. So when I talked about the dream of an SSD, part of the reason for that 5 gigabyte a second target was to eliminate loads, but also part of the reason for that target was streaming. As in,
Ну и чё,
what
нет
if
никого
the
на
SSD
стриме?
is so fast that as the player is turning around, it's possible to load textures for everything behind the player in that split second. If you figure that it takes half a second to turn, that's 4 gigabytes of compressed data you can load. That sounds about right for next gen. Anyway, back to the hard drive. Another strategy for
Там,
increasing
блядь, хуй
effective
поймешь,
read
почему
speed is to
лагает. То
make
ли много
big
открыто, то ли
sequential
чё, блядь.
chunks of data. For example, we might group all the data together for each city block. That removes most of the seeks, and the streaming gets faster. But there's a downside too, which is that frequently used data is included in many chunks and therefore is on the hard drive many, many times. Marvel's Spider-Man uses this strategy, and though it works very well for increasing the streaming speed, there's a massive duplication as a result. Some of the objects like mailboxes or news racks are on the hard drive 400 times. What I'm describing here are things that
Ты
cramp
купил
a creative
PS5? Нет,
director's
здорово,
time.
Марк.
Either
Она
level
не
design
вышла
gets a little
еще.
bit boring in places, or the data is duplicated so many times that it no longer fits on the Blu-ray disc. And you end up with hard limits on the player's run
Почему,
speed
блядь,
or
так
driving
криво-то
speed.
показывает?
The player can't go faster than the load speed from the hard drive. And finally, I'm sure many of you have noticed that after a patch download, the PlayStation 4 will sometimes take a long time to install the patch. That's because when just part of a file has been changed, the new data can be downloaded pretty quickly. But before the game boots up, a brand new file has to be constructed that
Из
includes
чего?
the changed portion. Otherwise, every change would
Блядь, в натуре, сука, я так и думал, сейчас скажет. В
Even so,
натуре,
you can
так и есть,
occasionally
кстати.
see this happening on game titles. They start to hitch once they get patched enough.
Якобы
With an
что-то там не
SSD,
тянется,
though,
настройками
no
странно,
seeks.
блядь.
So, no need to make brand new files with the
Подлагивает.
changes incorporated into them, which means no installs as you know them today. There's yet one more benefit, which is that system memory can be used much more efficiently. On PlayStation 4, game data on the hard drive feels very distant and difficult to use. By the time you realize you need
Всё,
a piece
звук,
of
всё
data,
нормально, да,
it's
на
much
стриме?
too late to go out and load it. So system memory has to contain all of the data that could be used in the next 30 seconds or so of gameplay. That means a lot of the 8
Нет, там можно
gigabytes of
понизить,
system
но
memory
я просто не
is
понимаю, в чем
idle.
проблема.
It's just waiting there to be potentially used. On PlayStation 5, though, the SSD is very close to being like more RAM. Typically, it's fast enough that when you realize you need a piece of data, you can just load it from the SSD and use it. There's no need to have lots of data parked in system memory waiting to potentially be used. A different way of saying that is that most of RAM is working on the game's behalf. This is one of the reasons that 16 gigabytes of GDDR6 feels right for PlayStation 5. The presence of the SSD reduces the need for a massive intergenerational increase in size. So back to the dream of the SSD. Here's the set of targets. Boot the game in a second. No load screens. Design freedom, meaning no twisty passages or long corridors. More game on the disk and more game on the SSD. And finally, those patch installs go away. The reality, though, is that the SSD is just one piece of the puzzle. There's a lot of places where bottlenecks can occur in between the SSD and the game code that uses the data. You can see this on PlayStation 4. If I use an SSD with 10 times the speed of a standard hard drive, I probably see only double the loading speed, if that. For PlayStation 5, our goal was not just that the SSD itself be 100 times faster. It was that game loads and streaming would be 100 times faster. So every single potential bottleneck needed to be addressed. And there are a lot of them. Let's look at check.
Блять, а если эту хуйню вот так
And what
сделать?
happens when its overhead gets 100 times larger? Conceptually, check-in is a pretty simple process. Data is loaded into system memory
Этот же
from a
стрим,
hard
этот
drive
же
or
стрим
SSD,
будет.
It's examined, a few values are tweaked to check it in, and then it's moved to its final location. At the SSD speeds we're talking about, that last part, moving the data, meaning copying it from one location to another, takes roughly an entire next-gen CPU core of custom units in our main chip. The flash controller in the SSD was designed for smooth and bottleneck-free operation, but also with games in it. For example, there are 6 levels of priority when reading from the SSD. Priority is very important. You can imagine the player heading into some new location in the world and the game requesting a few gigabytes of textures. And while those textures are being loaded, the enemy is shot and has to speak a few dying words. Having multiple priority levels lets the audio for those dying words get loaded immediately. On one side, that flash controller connects to the actual flash dies that supply the storage. To reach our bandwidth target of 5 gigabytes a second, we ended up with a 12-channel interface. 8 channels wouldn't be enough. The resulting bandwidth we've achieved is actually 5.5 gigabytes a second. With a 12-channel interface, the most natural size that emerges for an SSD is 825 gigabytes. The key question for us was, is that enough? I mean, it's tempting to add more, but flash certainly doesn't come cheap, and we have a responsibility to our gaming audience to be cost-effective with regards to what we put in the console. Ultimately, we resolved this question by looking at the play patterns of a broad range of